I never liked being home alone, but that night was different. My parents had gone to visit my aunt, leaving me alone for the first time in years. They trusted me, said I was old enough, and that nothing would happen. But as soon as they left, I felt a cold shiver down my spine. The house was quiet, too quiet. I could hear every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the leaves outside. I tried to keep busy, turning on the TV and watching my favorite show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went to the kitchen to make some popcorn. The microwave hummed, and the smell of butter filled the room. I felt a bit better with something to do. I grabbed the bowl of popcorn and went back to the living room. But then I heard it, a soft, faint sound, a whisper. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination. I turned the volume up on the TV, hoping to drown out the silence. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I shouted, standing up. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my phone, ready to call my parents, but then I stopped. They would just tell me I was being silly. I decided to check the house instead. I walked slowly down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The house was dark, only the dim light from the TV casting long shadows. I checked each room, turning on the lights as I went. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be. But then I reached the end of the hallway. The door to the basement was slightly open. I never went down there. It was always cold and damp, filled with old boxes and forgotten things. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The stairs creaked as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. I reached the bottom and turned on the light. The basement was empty, just as I had expected, but the whisper came again, louder, closer. I spun around, looking for the source. There in the corner was an old mirror. It was covered in dust, and the glass cracked in places. I walked over, wiping the dust away with my sleeve. My reflection stared back at me, pale and frightened. But then something moved behind me. I froze, staring at the mirror. A shadow, dark and shapeless, loomed over me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty basement. I ran back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, leaning against it to catch my breath. My heart was racing, my mind filled with fear. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But I knew better. Something was in the house with me. I went back to the living room, grabbing my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. But when I looked at my phone, there was no signal. The bars were gone, the screen flickering. I tried to dial, but it wouldn't connect. The whisper came again, louder than before. It was right behind me. I turned around slowly, and there it was. A shadow, dark and menacing, standing in the doorway. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It started to move towards me, gliding across the floor. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out, to escape, but my legs felt like lead. The shadow reached out, its hand stretching towards me. I could feel the cold, icy grip around my arm. I screamed, pulling away with all my strength. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I finally got it open and stumbled outside. The cool night air hit me, but I didn't stop. I ran down the street, not looking back. I reached my neighbor's house, banging on the door. They opened it, their faces filled with concern. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. They let me in, calling my parents and the police. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found nothing. No shadow, no sign of anyone else. They told me it was just my imagination, that I had scared myself. But I knew the truth. Something was in that house, something dark and evil. My parents came home, comforting me and telling me everything was okay. But I knew better. I never stayed home alone again. The memory of that night haunted me, the whispering shadow always lurking in the back of my mind. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? I don't know. But I do know one thing. I was not alone that night, and I never will be again. I've never been a fan of buying things online, but when I moved to my new apartment, I needed a couch. My budget was tight, so I turned to Craigslist. After a few days of searching, I found a listing for a beautiful, slightly used couch. The price was low, almost too good to be true. I should have known better, but I was excited. The ad was simple: couch for sale. Excellent condition. Contact Rob. The pictures showed a stylish, dark gray couch, and it looked perfect for my living room. I sent a message to Rob and quickly got a reply. He told me he was moving out of town and needed to get rid of the couch fast. We agreed to meet at his place the next evening. I arrived at the address Rob had given me, which was a small, rundown house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood felt eerie, especially as the sun began to set. I parked my car and walked up to the front door. As I knocked, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Rob opened the door. He was a tall, thin man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "You must be here for the couch," he said, his voice raspy. I nodded, and he stepped aside to let me in. The house was dark and smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. Rob led me to the living room where the couch was waiting. It looked just like the picture, maybe even better. I sat down and tested it out. It was comfortable, and I was sold. "I'll take it," I said, pulling out the $50 from my wallet. Rob's eyes gleamed as he took the money. "Great," he said. "I'll help you load it into your car." As we struggled to carry the couch out the front door, I noticed something strange. The walls in the hallway were covered with newspaper clippings. They were all about local burglaries and home invasions. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone have these all over their walls? Rob caught me staring and quickly said, "I'm a bit of a crime buff. I find these stories fascinating." I forced a smile and nodded, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. We finally got the couch into my car, and I thanked Rob, eager to leave. As I drove home, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The entire experience felt surreal, and Rob's house kept popping back into my mind. A week later, I was sitting on my new couch watching TV when I heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like footsteps. My heart started racing. I lived alone, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and quietly made my way to the kitchen. I flicked on the light, and there he was, Rob, rummaging through my drawers. He looked up, surprised and angry. "What are you doing here?" I shouted, tightening my grip on the bat. Rob smirked. "You made it too easy. I knew where you lived, and I knew you'd be alone. I've been watching you." Fear coursed through me, but I tried to stay calm. "Get out of my house now!" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. Rob took a step toward me, and I swung the bat, hitting him in the arm. He cursed and lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. We struggled, but I managed to kick him off and ran to my phone to call the police. I locked myself in the bathroom and waited, shaking with fear. I could hear Rob banging on the door, trying to get in. It felt like hours, but finally I heard the sound of sirens. The police burst in, and Rob tried to escape, but they tackled him to the ground and arrested him. The police later told me that Rob was a wanted thief. He would sell items online, learn about his buyers, and then rob their homes. I was lucky to be alive. They found evidence in his house linking him to several other crimes. The newspaper clippings were his trophies, reminders of his past burglaries. I was relieved that Rob was finally caught, but the experience left me shaken. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I came to being another one of his victims. I got rid of the couch, unable to look at it without feeling a wave of terror. From then on, I was more cautious about buying things online. I made sure to meet sellers in public places and never gave out my address. The whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson about trust and safety. Even now, whenever I hear a strange noise at night, my mind goes back to that terrifying encounter. It's a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, and sometimes a great deal isn't worth the risk. It was a dark and quiet night. I was alone at home, sitting on the couch and watching TV. My husband was away on a business trip, and the kids stayed at their grandparents' house for the weekend. The house was unusually silent, and I found it peaceful and eerie. I liked the calmness, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. Every small noise made me jump. I decided to make myself some tea. The kitchen was dimly lit, and I could see the shadows dancing on the walls. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. I boiled some water, made my tea, and went back to the living room. As I sat back down, I heard a strange sound coming from the window. It was a faint scratching noise, like something sharp scraping against the glass. My heart started to race. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch tapping against the window, but deep down, I knew it was something else. I stood up and slowly walked towards the window. As I got closer, the scratching grew louder. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the curtain aside. There I saw a shadowy figure standing outside. I froze in fear. The figure was tall and bulky, and I could barely make out his features in the dark. He was wearing a mask that covered his face, making him look even more terrifying. Before I could react, he smashed the window with a loud crash. Glass shattered everywhere, and I stumbled back, falling to the floor. The intruder climbed through the broken window and into my living room. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning every corner. Then he spotted me lying on the floor. He walked towards me, and I could see the glint of a knife in his hand. "Don't move," he growled. His voice was deep and menacing. I nodded, too scared to say anything. He grabbed my arm and pulled me to my feet. "Where's your money?" he demanded. I don't have much cash," I stammered, "but there's some in the drawer in the kitchen." He shoved me towards the kitchen, keeping a tight grip on my arm. I led him to the drawer where we kept some emergency cash. He yanked it open and grabbed the money, stuffing it into his pocket. Then he turned his attention to the rest of the house. "Where else do you keep your valuables?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "In the bedroom," I whispered. "There's some jewelry on the bedside table." He dragged me upstairs to the bedroom. I pointed to the drawer, and he rifled through it, taking all the jewelry he could find. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me as he ransacked my home. I didn't know what else he would take, or if he would hurt me. All I could do was hope and pray that he would leave soon. After what felt like an eternity, he seemed satisfied with his loot. He looked at me, his expression hidden behind the mask. "Stay here," he ordered. "Don't move until I'm gone." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. He turned and walked out of the bedroom, heading back downstairs. I heard him moving around, opening and closing drawers, and then the sound of the front door opening. I stayed still, too afraid to follow him. Minutes passed, and the house grew silent again. I finally mustered the courage to move. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The front door was wide open, and the intruder was gone. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was trembling as I told the operator what had happened. They assured me that the police were on their way. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest, waiting for them to arrive. When the police got there, they asked me a lot of questions. I told them everything I could remember about the intruder. They took notes and looked around the house for evidence. I felt a little better knowing they were there, but I was still scared. A few days later, the police called me. They had found the intruder. He had been caught trying to sell the jewelry he stole from my house. The relief I felt was overwhelming. They told me he had a record and had been involved in several burglaries in the area. This time, though, he wouldn't be getting away. I still feel uneasy when I'm home alone, especially at night. The memory of that terrifying night is hard to forget. But I am grateful for the police and for the fact that the intruder was caught. Now, I always make sure to double-check the locks on all the doors and windows before I go to bed. And I never take the safety of my home for granted. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. In college, I met Mark. He was friendly, always cracking jokes and organizing parties. We became close friends quickly. Everyone liked him. He had that charm. But there was something mysterious about him. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One night, after a party at his place, I saw Mark arguing with someone outside. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension was palpable. When I asked him about it the next day, he brushed it off, saying it was just a misunderstanding. As time passed, I noticed more odd things about Mark. He would disappear for days without explanation, claiming he was visiting family or taking a spontaneous trip. He never invited any of us along. Then one day, I stumbled upon a newspaper article online. It was about a robbery at a local bank. The surveillance footage showed a masked man who bore a striking resemblance to Mark. My heart sank as I read further details about the crime. Could it be him? I confronted Mark about it, my hands trembling. At first, he denied everything, insisting it was a case of mistaken identity. But when I showed him the article and the photos, his expression hardened. He admitted that yes, he was involved in some shady stuff to make ends meet. I was shocked and scared. How could someone I considered a friend be mixed up in criminal activities? He tried to justify himself, saying he was in debt and had no other choice. He swore he was trying to turn his life around. But I couldn't shake off the fear. What if he got caught? What if he dragged me into his mess? I started avoiding him, ignoring his calls and messages. The guilt gnawed at me, but I couldn't risk being associated with a criminal. Months went by and I tried to move on with my life. I focused on my studies and made new friends. But every now and then, I would hear whispers about Mark. Rumors of his involvement in other crimes began to surface. It seemed he was spiraling into the underworld. Then one night, I received a frantic call from Mark. He sounded panicked, desperate. He pleaded with me to meet him, saying he needed my help. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a deserted park on the outskirts of town. Mark looked haggard, shadows under his eyes, his hands shaking. He told me he was being hunted by some dangerous people he owed money to. He begged me to hide him, just for a few days. I hesitated, torn between my loyalty to a friend and my fear of getting involved in something dangerous. But when I saw the fear in his eyes, I couldn't turn him away. I took him to my apartment, praying silently that I wasn't making a terrible mistake. For the next few days, I lived in constant fear. Every noise outside made me jump. Every passing stranger made me paranoid. Mark hardly left the apartment, always on edge, watching out the window like a hunted animal. One evening, as I returned from class, I found my apartment door ajar. Panic surged through me as I pushed it open cautiously. The place was ransacked, furniture overturned, and drawers emptied, and Mark was gone. I sank to the floor feeling numb. I had let a criminal into my life, into my home. And now, I didn't know where he was or what trouble he had brought upon me. I called the police, trembling as I recounted everything. The investigation that followed was grueling. I was questioned extensively about Mark, his activities, and his acquaintances. They searched my apartment for evidence, but there was little to find. It seemed Mark had covered his tracks well. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal. The fear and paranoia began to fade, replaced by a cautious awareness. I never heard from Mark again, and part of me was relieved. But sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows dance, I remember the fear in Mark's eyes. I wonder where he is now, what kind of life he's living, and I pray that I'll never have to encounter him again, that his shadow will remain just that, a haunting memory of a friend who was not what he seemed. My name is James, and I love watching horror movies. One dark and stormy night, I decided to watch one of my favorites. The rain was pouring outside, and the wind howled like a wolf. I was home alone, sitting on the couch with a big bowl of popcorn. The movie was scary, and every little sound made me jump. The house was old and creaky, and I could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the windows. I pulled a blanket around me and tried to focus on the movie. Suddenly, I heard a loud knock coming from the basement. My heart skipped a beat. I paused the movie and listened carefully. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard the knock again, louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was the only one home, and no one ever went into the basement. It was a dark and damp place filled with old, forgotten things. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just the wind or the old pipes making noise. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Gathering all my courage, I stood up and walked to the basement door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The air felt colder near the door, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Slowly, I opened the door and peered into the darkness. The light switch was just inside the door, and I quickly turned it on. The dim light flickered for a moment before it lit up the wooden stairs leading down to the basement. I took a deep breath and started descending the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing in the stillness. The basement smelled musty, like old wood and dust. I reached the bottom and looked around. Everything seemed normal. Boxes were stacked against the walls, and old furniture was covered in white sheets. But then I heard the knock again, this time right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The sound seemed to come from the far corner of the basement, where an old wooden cabinet stood. The cabinet was something that had always been there, but I never paid much attention to it. It was dusty and covered in cobwebs. With shaky hands, I walked over to the cabinet. The knocking had stopped, but the air felt heavy and oppressive. I reached out and touched the handle of the cabinet, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The hinges squeaked loudly, and I held my breath as I looked inside. It was empty. except for an old tattered book lying on the bottom shelf. The book looked ancient, with a leather cover that was cracked and worn. I picked it up carefully and blew the dust off the cover. There were no markings on the outside, just a plain brown cover. I opened it and the pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting was old-fashioned and hard to read, but I could make out some of the words. It seemed to be a diary of some sort, written by someone who had lived in the house long ago. As I read through the pages, I felt a growing sense of unease. The diary talked about strange noises and sightings in the house, much like the ones I had experienced. The writer described hearing knocks and whispers and feeling like they were being watched. The last entry was particularly chilling. It said, "The knocking is getting louder. I fear something is trying to get out." Suddenly, the basement light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I gasped and dropped the book. My flashlight app was the only source of light now, and I quickly turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I still felt incredibly alone and scared. I picked up the book again and decided to take it upstairs where it was safer and brighter. As I turned to leave, I heard the knocking again, this time coming from the walls around me. It was louder and more insistent. I raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the basement door behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. The knocking had stopped, but I could still feel the cold, eerie presence. Back in the living room, I put the book on the coffee table and sat down, trying to calm myself. I decided to call my friend Mark and tell him what happened. Mark was always good at calming me down and had a logical explanation for everything. But as I reached for my phone, the power went out completely, leaving me in pitch darkness. I sat there feeling the darkness pressing in on me. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows. I tried to call Mark, but my phone had no signal. I felt utterly alone and scared. The knocking started again, this time coming from all around the house. It was like something was trying to get in, or maybe trying to get out. I grabbed the old book and held it close, feeling like it was my only connection to what was happening. The knocking grew louder and more frantic, echoing through the empty house. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but I was frozen with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The house was silent, except for the sound of my breathing. The power came back on, and the lights flickered back to life. I looked around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. Just the old empty house. I never found out what caused the knocking that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by the horror movie and the old creepy house. Or maybe there was something in the basement, something that had been locked away for a long time. I never went back down there, and I put the old book back in the cabinet, hoping to forget about it. But now and then, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I hear the faint sound of knocking coming from deep within the walls. In 2003, I needed a roommate. Living alone in my small apartment was getting too expensive, so I decided to find someone to share the rent. I went on Craigslist and posted an ad. I was hoping to find someone nice and normal. A few days later, I got a response from a guy named John Williams. He seemed nice enough over email, and he needed a place to stay soon. We met up, and he looked normal, just an average guy in his late 20s. I thought this could work out. John moved in quickly. At first, everything seemed fine. We didn't see each other much because of our different schedules. I worked during the day, and he worked at night. We had short chats in the morning or late at night. He was polite and kept to himself. It was a good arrangement, or so I thought. After a few weeks, I started noticing some strange things. John was hardly ever home. Sometimes he would disappear for days without a word. When he did come back, he looked tired and nervous. I thought maybe he had a demanding job or some personal issues. I didn't want to pry, so I let it go. One day, I found my mail in the trash. It was torn up into small pieces. I was confused and a little angry. Why would someone do that? I asked John if he had seen anyone near our mailbox, but he just shrugged and said no. His answer didn't satisfy me, but I had no proof he was involved. A few days later, I noticed John's bedroom door was always locked. This was odd because he never mentioned anything valuable in there. My curiosity grew stronger each day. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. One weekend, John was gone again. I decided to break into his room. I know it wasn't right, but I needed to know what was going on. I used a screwdriver to pick up the lock and finally opened the door. The room looked normal at first, just like any other bedroom. But then I saw a folder on his desk. I opened the folder and my heart skipped a beat. Inside, there were pieces of my torn-up mail, documents with my personal information, and a diary. I started reading the diary, and what I found was terrifying. John had written detailed entries about my daily activities, my friends, and even my family. It felt like he was watching me all the time. One entry stood out. It said, "Brian is getting suspicious. I need to be more careful." That sentence sent chills down my spine. Who was this guy living in my apartment? I decided to Google his name, John Williams. Nothing unusual came up. Then I searched for any clues from his diary. I found a name he had mentioned a few times, Dino Lawrence Smith. When I searched that name, the results shocked me. Dino Lawrence Smith was a wanted jewel thief with a long criminal record. There was even a picture, and it was John. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone to call the police. I told them everything I had found. They asked me to come down to the station with the evidence. I packed the folder and rushed there. At the police station, I gave the officers the folder and explained my situation. They checked their records and told me something that both relieved and terrified me. Dino Lawrence Smith had been arrested a few days ago. He was already in custody. I felt a wave of relief knowing that he wasn't coming back to the apartment. But the thought of living with a wanted criminal for months haunted me. What if he had hurt me? What if he had stolen my identity? The police assured me that I was safe now, but they advised me to change all my passwords and keep an eye on my credit reports. I followed their advice and took extra precautions. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole ordeal. I cleaned out John's room and threw away all his belongings. I wanted no trace of him left in my home. I also installed better locks and a security system. It's been years since that happened, but I still get uneasy when I think about it. Finding a roommate on Craigslist seemed like a good idea at the time, but it turned into a nightmare. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I never saw or heard from John, or rather Dino again, but the experience taught me a valuable lesson about trust and safety. Now, whenever someone asks about my craziest roommate story, I tell them about the time I lived with a wanted jewel thief. It's a story that still gives me chills, even after all these years. I work the night shift at the Maple Inn, a small, rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The job is usually quiet, almost boring. I spend most nights watching TV or reading old magazines left behind by guests. But one night, things took a terrifying turn that I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday, and the motel was nearly empty. Only 2 rooms were occupied, one by an elderly couple passing through town, and the other by a truck driver who checked in late that evening. The clock showed 1:15 a.m., and I was fighting to stay awake. The flickering fluorescent lights above the front desk did little to help my fatigue. The lobby was dim, and the only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a loud bang. A man stumbled in, looking frantic and disheveled. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was a mess. He had a wild look in his eyes that made my heart race. He rushed to the front desk, slamming his hands down with such force that I jumped. "Please, I need a room," he gasped, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. His voice was strained, filled with urgency. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sure, I can get you a room. Do you have a reservation?" He shook his head quickly. No reservation. I just need a room, right now." I nodded, feeling uneasy. I grabbed a key from the rack behind me and handed it to him. "Room 105, down the hall to your left." He snatched the key from my hand and darted down the hallway, not even waiting for any formalities or paperwork. I watched him go, my heart pounding. Something about the way he looked and acted filled me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After he disappeared into his room, I sat back down at the desk, my mind racing. I tried to focus on the TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man. Who was he running from? Why was he so scared? I decided to keep an eye on the security monitors that showed the hallways and parking lot. For a while, everything was quiet. The truck driver went to his room, and the elderly couple didn't come out at all. But then around 2:30 a.m., I saw the man from room 105 again. He was pacing back and forth outside his door, looking even more agitated than before. He kept glancing down the hallway, towards the lobby. I was about to go check on him when he suddenly stopped and looked directly at one of the cameras. His eyes seemed to bore into the lens, and for a moment, I felt like he was staring right at me. Then he turned and ran down the hallway toward the back exit. I watched on the monitor as he disappeared into the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I waited a few minutes, hoping he would come back, but he never did. Finally, I decided to call the police. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that they would send someone to check it out. About 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. I let them in and showed them the security footage of the man. They watched carefully, nodding as they took notes. "Do you have any idea who he might be?" one of the officers asked. I shook my head. "No, he just showed up out of nowhere. He seemed scared." The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll check the room he was in and look around the area. Stay here." They went down the hall to room 105. Guns were drawn. I watched from the lobby, my heart in my throat. They knocked on the door and then entered cautiously. A few minutes later, they came back out, looking puzzled. "There's no one in the room," one of the officers said. "It's empty." I frowned, but I saw him go in there. He didn't come out until I saw him on the cameras. The officers nodded. "We believe you. We'll do a sweep of the area, keep your doors locked, and call us if you see anything else." They left to search the motel grounds. I locked the front door and sat back down at the desk, feeling more uneasy than ever. Time seemed to crawl as I waited, listening for any sound that might indicate the man had returned. Around 4 a.m., the officers came back. They hadn't found any sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye on the area, then left. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept glancing at the security monitors, half expecting to see the man staring back at me again. When the morning finally came, I was relieved. The day shift worker arrived, and I quickly filled them in on what had happened. As I left the motel, the bright sunlight did little to ease my nerves. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and what he might have been running from. Even now, months later, I still think about that night. The police never found any trace of the man, and no one ever came looking for him. Sometimes, late at night, I can still see his wild eyes staring into the camera, and I wonder if he's still out there, running from whatever terror drove him to the Maple Inn. I had been driving for hours on that lonely highway, surrounded by darkness and silence. The only company I had was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of road signs passing by. It was past midnight, and I was tired, longing for the comfort of my bed at home. The road seemed endless, stretching out into the horizon with no other cars in sight. I began to feel a sense of unease, as if I was being watched by something unseen in the shadows. But I shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the deserted road. Suddenly, my headlights caught a figure up ahead, a man standing by the side of the road. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows cast from the trees lining the highway. I hesitated, wondering why someone would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour. As I approached, my heart raced. Something was unsettling about him, something that sent a chill down my spine. He made no move to flag me down or signal for help, which only added to the mystery of his presence. I decided to slow down as I passed him, my eyes locked on his silhouette. He turned his head slowly, as if following my car with his gaze. That's when I noticed his eyes, piercing and intense, gleaming in the dim light. It was then that I realized he wasn't just standing there, he was waiting. A wave of fear washed over me, instinctively telling me to drive faster and get away from him. But as I pressed the gas pedal, I saw in my rearview mirror that he had started walking towards my car. His movements were slow and deliberate, yet unnervingly steady. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe he needed help. Maybe he was stranded out here. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong. I kept driving, my heart pounding louder with each passing second. Glancing back again, I saw that he was now running, closing the distance between us faster than I thought possible. Panic seized me as I realized he was not looking for help. He was hunting. I swerved around a bend in the road, my tires screeching against the pavement. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I call for help? Should I try to lose him on these twisting, unfamiliar roads? But my phone had no signal, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly into the night. I could feel his presence behind me, like a shadow creeping closer. He was gaining on me, his footsteps echoing in my mind. Desperation took hold as I searched for any sign of civilization, any place to find refuge from this nightmare. Finally, I saw a faint glow in the distance, the lights of a gas station. Relief flooded through me as I turned towards it, praying that someone would be there to help. As I pulled into the empty parking lot, I glanced back one last time. He was gone. Shaking with fear and adrenaline, I stumbled out of my car and into the gas station. The attendant behind the counter looked at me with concern as I tried to explain what had happened. But when we went outside to check, there was no trace of the man I had encountered on the highway. They called the police, who arrived shortly after. I gave them a description of the man, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find him. He was like a ghost, appearing out of nowhere and disappearing just as quickly. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. But that night on the empty highway, I learned a chilling truth. Sometimes, the darkest terrors are found in the loneliest places.